Alex Salmond, who so nearly led Scotland to independence and changed the UK, has died. He took the SNP from the fringes to become a conquering force. We'll be joined by John Swinney, Scotland's First Minister and the leader of the SNP. Keir Starmer's big promise to all of us was to fix the economy. But after 100 days in office, we'll ask, can the government make us better off? The ministers have already offended one big business, the owner of P&O Ferries. The Transport Secretary said she would boycott their boats. So this morning with us, a business secretary and a banker, Jonathan Reynolds for the government, and Charlie Nunn, the boss of Britain's biggest bank, Lloyds. And the race for the Tory crown is down to 2. Robert Jenrick will be with us today to answer some of your questions. And our team at the desk for the next hour this week. Brian Cox, the actor and supporter of Scottish independence, the Lib Dems deputy leader Daisy Cooper, and the billionaire businessman John Caldwell. Morning. Let's start by looking at the news headlines. And of course, it's dominated by the death of Alex Salmond. It's on the front page of the Sunday Times today and right across the Scottish front pages. The National splashing with his final words in public: Scotland is a country, not a county. Keir Starmer's been talking to the Sunday Mirror, marking 100 days of Labour in power. And the Mail on Sunday claims that the Met was forced by the Attorney General to give Taylor Swift blue light escorts to her shows at Wembley. Well, warm welcome to all three of you this morning. Let's start talking about Alex Salmond. Brian, you knew him well. You even appeared recently on one of his new TV programmes he was doing on Turkish TV. What are your memories of him?
He was a lot of fun. He was very entertaining. He had great humanity. He was probably, I think, one of the greatest political thinkers that certainly Scotland has ever produced, and I think possibly these islands have ever produced. He was an extraordinary man. I think his essential appeal was his humanity and how he came across to other people. I mean, you know, when I first met Alex, I was, of course, not an SNP. I was a Labour supporter. And then what happened with Labour, and you were just talking about that just now, it made me very disillusioned, especially with social democracy. And I felt the one place that social democracy was happening was back in my own country. So I suddenly had to rethink my whole feelings. And Alex he enabled me to do that.
So he was the conduit for you?
Very much so, very much so.
And what do you think his impact was on politics in Scotland, not just in Scotland, but actually across the UK?
Considerable, because he challenged. You know, Alex's favourite thing, ironically, when we lost the 2014 referendum, he was really looking forward to get back into Parliament because he was a great parliamentarian, and that was his great gift. That's what he loved more than anything else, was the debate, and the debate to be, and he loved actually, ironically, being in the House of Commons, which was
in Westminster, which for somebody who wanted
was something which was kind of, but you know, he pleaded the cause, and he pleaded the cause with, again, great humanity and great understanding of what Scotland, you know, Scotland has been a second-class nation for a long time, and Alex went to battle on that, and he made me aware of something which I'd kind of, you know, when you're young and you have ambition, you want to. And my great thing was I looked at the Tay. I come from Dundee. I looked at the Tay, and I think I'm going to cross that one day. I'm going to get down to the south. And as I got older, I realised, actually, my country's not bad. In fact, my country's pretty damn good. And I think Alex is what he really fought for the country.
Daisy, as a Lib Dem, of course, the Lib Dems have had a prominent role in Scottish politics too. But as a Lib Dem, how would you see his role in changing things, not just in Scotland but also across the UK?
Yeah, well, look, I never met him on a personal level, but I think he really typifies a particular type of politician, somebody who has a lot of charisma, somebody who has a big personality, somebody who is ruthless in pursuit of the things that he really believed in. So there's no doubt. But of course, Like many in the SNP, he was so focused on independence, and that was his driving cause for most of his life. And I'm sure all of our thoughts will be with his family and friends.
And later in the programme, we'll talk to the current First Minister, John Swinney, who's the leader of the SNP and someone who worked alongside him for decades. We're also, though, John, going to talk a lot about the economy today. Now, just before the election, you, as a billionaire who's created a huge business, backed the Labour Party.
I would prefer the title philanthropist, although I am a businessman, but I spent all of my life on philanthropy at the moment.
OK. You have then, like everybody, been watching what's happening in the first few months of Labour in office, and we'll hear more from the Business Secretary in just a moment. But there are lots of stories and noises off in some of the news about wealthy people feeling nervous, some wealthy people even leaving the country, and particularly about the possibility of capital gains tax that's paid on share sales or selling property off, going up perhaps even to 39%. What would you make of that if that happened on that specific?
On that specific, it's difficult to comment because it's not about specifics. It's about doing everything that's in balance right for Britain. We have to grow the economy. We have to attract inward businesses. Anything that we do that might be negative to attract inward businesses and inward wealthy people is a negative. I'm not too worried about losing the odd few people to Monaco or wherever who want to avoid paying any tax. They've already gone, most of them, but there are issues all around the policies that we have to be very careful of. I don't agree with the non-dom, changing the non-dom rules. I think that's unfair to a section of the non-doms. Not all the non-doms, but some of the non-doms that's unfair to. And we're going to lose people that can help make Britain prosperous. But we have to take a balanced viewpoint in order to put the great back in Britain. And if we get it wrong, it's at our peril. We cannot lose too many wealthy people, but more importantly, we have to attract inward investment. That's the big thing.
OK, well, that's what the government's going to be trying to do this week. And let's hear from the Business Secretary, because Keir Starmer's always told anyone and any microphone within spitting distance that his first job is to sort out the economy after years of it being in the doldrums. And ministers hope this week plenty of cheques will be written at a big business summit that they're holding tomorrow in London. But the warm-up for that big event has been disrupted by the Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh. Now, she offended one of the huge firms that was invited, DP World, by saying that she would boycott them and they were a rogue operator. Well, Jonathan Reynolds is the Business Secretary and he's with us now. We'll get to all of that important stuff in a few minutes. But first of all, I just want to ask you your reaction to Alex Salmond passing away.
Of course, in the political sphere, a huge figure, formidable campaigner, great communicator. I always felt, despite being for independence, he knew how to use the House of Commons. He was at home in that environment and a huge contribution to politics, no doubt about that. OK, and
there'll be plenty more discussion of that in the programme with John Swinney later in the programme. Let's talk then about business and Labour's relationship with them. I'm going to play our audience, in case they missed it, what your colleague, the Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, said about DP World that owns P&O ferries this week.
They're a rogue operator. We're cracking down on the way that they've treated employees, and we want to see them mirror the standards of other operators that come in and out of Great Britain's waters.
Would you travel with P&O ferries?
No, I've been boycotting P&O ferries for 2.5 years, and I'd encourage consumers to do the same.
OK, what part of that do you disagree with?
Look, we have always said, and we believe, that what happened with P&O ferries was wrong. I believe even the Conservative government at the time was clear that they believed it was wrong. The problem was it was lawful then. It's not going to be lawful now. And so we have changed the law. We've got part of our Employment Rights Bill is what does this.
And therefore, when they got rid of some staff and then rehired them on worse
fire and rehire, and a particularly egregious case. So we were clear about that. I'm not going to recall from that position. But where companies accept that we're not allowing that to happen anymore, and we can work with them on investments into the country, we can have a conversation with them, we will do. So it's not the government's position to boycott them, but we are clear, we do not want this country competing on fire and rehire. We are changing that. This week we've seen that Employment Rights Bill giving more security for people in some of the lowest paid insecure work in the country, at the same time as having our investment summit, bringing billions to the country. That is pro-business, pro-worker in action, and that is the government's position.
Are P&O ferries a rogue operator, as she said?
No, that's not the government's position, but I think we've got to make clear that we do not support fire and rehire, but we believe, and we are showing, we can improve the labour market, improve people's employment rights, at the same time as attracting the kind of investments which we need as a country.
So hang on, you've just said clearly it's not the government's position that P&O and DP World are a rogue operator. There was a government press release that said it was a rogue employer that went out in the name of the government. We can show it there. There's a quote. Comments on an official government press release calling them a rogue employer. So, but that's not the government's position.
Look, I'm happy to clarify that. I speak for the government on business issues as the business secretary. We will always make clear what happened was wrong. That's why we're changing the law, to make sure it can't happen again.
But hang on,
where
so the
companies
Transport
accept that
Secretary
change.
is not speaking for the government. You are speaking for the government.
Well, look, I can tell you what the government's position is, and I can also tell you, by the way, that I work with the Transport Secretary on a whole range of issues integral to getting inward investment into the country. She's part of the team that has produced, and you will see in just a day's time, the scale of investments that can come to the UK because of the different platform
But
this
this is really
provides.
important, because one thing that you've said lots of times in this studio, that Keir Starmer has told the public many times, is that Labour will bring clarity and they will bring competence and they will give a clear message at all times, particularly to business. And that here we have, in a matter of days, the Transport Secretary giving one position, the Business Secretary then saying that's not the position, an official piece of government communication going out into public saying another position. It doesn't look very good, does it? It looks messy.
I'm pleased to be able to put what the government's position is. I'm pleased to be able to tell you we are stopping fire and rehire. DP World are coming to the summit. The investment will go ahead. So I think that's what...
So that will go ahead. So they will spend £1 billion in this country, even though Louise Hay clearly offended them.
It will go ahead. And look, we're a serious government. Where things like this, we know sometimes little things like this crop up. We'll fix them.
It's not a little thing, is it? There was £1 billion on the table here.
And I just think you have to take that step back and say, this is a government that is improving people's security in the workplace across the board and attracting the key flagship investments necessary to take the economy forward. That's what it's about.
But when you were in opposition, you used to call for the last government to suspend contracts and licences with this business. So is it just the case that now you're in the government, you need the cash, so you'll do a deal?
No, it's now the case that as we're in government, we can stop what happened to P&O Ferries happening again. And where people can accept that's changing, can work with us, can bring investments. Of course, we'll talk to people wanting to bring money to the country. But at the same time, we don't just want growth. We want growth that every person feels and it benefits their lives. That's why you've got to tackle some of these parts of the employment law framework, which we inherited. That is what we are doing. And we're doing it at the same time as those investors still want to come to the UK. That is important. That is how you make an economy work for people in a way it hasn't worked for the previous 14 years.
And would you and your family use P&O ferries?
I have not had to use a ferry recently. If a company can accept the employment law framework that this government is about good jobs for people and can do that in a way whilst making a contribution to the UK, I would use that company, yes.
And just to clarify, the press release that we showed was a press release from when you were in opposition, so just to be clear about that. You are launching an industrial strategy tomorrow as this investment summit is getting going. But there are big things that have already happened since you've been in power. We know many jobs are being lost at Port Talbot in Wales, where there's a steel plant, and Scotland's last remaining oil refinery, Grangemouth, is going to close. And there are no signs of the government doing anything to stop that happening. Why not?
Well, first of all, on Port Talbot, we have substantially improved that deal by working with the company. We have put more money on the table. We're in a process of looking at getting the business case, because you can't do it in a short space of time, for new investments in Port Talbot, keeping more jobs.
So why aren't you taking action to keep Grangemouth open, to save the last oil refinery in Grangemouth, the kinds of jobs that people rely on?
Now, it's a lead from the Energy Department, not from myself. We are working with the Scottish Government, collaboration for the first time. It shows very much the reset in relationships between different parts of the UK on an industrial future for Grangemouth. That could involve public investment with the private sector, but the Project Willow, as it's called, is looking at 3 potential usages of Grangemouth going forward. An industrial future, of course, at the minute, you will know it's under commercial ownership, and of course it's losing a lot of money. That's the background.
Project Willow, you refer to then, wouldn't be ready in time to save the refinery as it stands and to save the jobs that exist right now. So you're promising a big industrial strategy to shake things up, to get the economy working in the way that you want it to, Will you commit to saving existing jobs at Grangemouth?
I can't do that because that is part of the work that is going on with the Scottish Government and this new Labour government. But let's be clear, industrial strategy is not just about giving money to firms that are making losses. You know, that's not what it is. It's about attracting the kind of investment we need in the key sectors of the economy that make the biggest difference to our growth, to our productivity, to wages and people's prosperity. So I have had already things I inherited, things I didn't know were in that position. I mean, Harland and Wolff is a good example, where the previous government had simply not taken any action. I had to sort that out. That's not always going in there putting in public money. Sometimes that's the wrong thing to do. You've got to allow a market solution. So I just want to be clear. It's not about going around the country writing cheques. It's about attracting the investment, working with the private sector on the future.
But you did hint there that there could be some public investment for Grangemouth, and it is the worst kept secret in Westminster that your colleague, the Chancellor, is going to change the way that the debt rules work in order to invest in things, perhaps something like Grangemouth. Is there a chance that public money will be used to help keep it open?
Look, first thing is the Chancellor's already changed the fiscal rules to allow for greater long-term capital investment, to stop that capital budget being raided to pay for revenue spending. That's our first fiscal rule. That's the day-to-day spending rule. Now, we've got new institutions, the National Wealth Fund, for instance, that are there to work with the private sector on some of these long-term investment transformations. But for Grangemouth, it's about what the future use will be. Clearly, at the minute, where it's at is a difficult position. I'm thinking very much about the workers involved in that, but it's about getting that long-term industrial future for the site.
We just heard from John Caldwell, who's a philanthropist and billionaire and businessman who has backed Labour, but he said you need to be very, very careful about some of the things that you do in order that people who want to invest, people who want to make money, don't feel that the UK is not their home. Are you being careful enough? Will you rule out increasing national insurance payments, increasing for employers, which essentially would make it more expensive for businesses to hire people?
Everyone in government, especially myself and the Chancellor, are focused on that growth mission, that balance that John was talking about. You know, I'm not going to talk about the budget 17 days before it happens. Only the Chancellor is going to be able to do that. But I am hugely optimistic.
You have ruled out lots and lots of different tax rises on many times in this studio and others.
That's part of our manifesto, and you know that. But we don't write a budget day by day. You've got to wait a little bit of time for that to happen. I can tell you that we are massively optimistic about the future of this country, and actually where you need to get that private investment in, as we're doing this week at the Investment Summit. It isn't just about one budget, it's about the long-term future, the stability of policy. You know, the UK's position has been transformed for investors by the general election because we have political stability, we have an outward-looking government, we have a government committed to removing the barriers to investment. That is attractive.
Except that also many businesses have had real nerves about some of the messages about doom and gloom. I know you'll say that that's being honest with people, but actually consumer confidence, according to some surveys, have fallen. Business confidence, according to some measures, has fallen. You see things like one of the big investors in Sainsbury's pulling out £300 million of their stake, and the business saying that people are actually spending less because they're worried about what they've heard from you.
The reality is, and I think being open about this is right, you walk into government, you find things far worse than you realised. There were key things that hadn't been funded. I mean, the public sector pay bodies just hidden in a drawer, you know, pretending that wasn't a thing a government has to deal with. Of course, when you're in that position, people are going to go, OK, this is worse than we thought it was going to be, a little bit perhaps worried about that. It's the budget and the spending review where we can put that long-term future in place. But look, I could also tell you about the £8 billion of investment already announced from Amazon Web Services, the £10 billion from Blackstone into data centres, particularly in the northeast, that failed British Vault site, now up and going to have that investment coming forward. So when you see the scale of what we're able to announce next week, when you look at how we can do that, whilst making sure that's going to be growth that benefits for everyone. When we can say, of course, that optimistic future is going to be built on responsibility with the public finances, long-term investment, but also through that industrial strategy, working with business on the long-term changes necessary to make sure we're competitive in the most important sectors. I am really excited for the future, and I think people will be too.
OK, well, we'll watch with interest what happens this week and how many big cheques you get business to write. Jonathan Reynolds, Business Secretary, thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning. Good to have you as ever. Well, what did you think of what he had to say? You can let us know, of course. Email us kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or a new innovation that we have. You can send us a WhatsApp on 08000 282161. I'm sure I'll get used to reading out that long number. It's 08000 282161. And of course, there's lots happening on the BBC Live page. You can see the address there. And you know that we'll try and share some of the conversation that you're sending us in later in the show or in our newsletter later in the week. Well, are the government's plans for business realistic 100 days in? Are the plans that Jonathan Reynolds was talking about, do they really add up and are they credible? Well, the boss of the biggest bank in the country, Lloyds, the chief executive, Charlie Nunn, is here. Welcome to you. You know a thing or two about making the sums add up. So let's see what you think of what's going on right now. Now, you're a part of the government's investment summit this week, but you have contact with millions of customers and businesses every single week. What do you think is going on in the economy in brass tacks? Because people have had a rough time. How does it look to you now?
Yes, good morning, Laura. As you say, we support 27 million customers, 1 in 5 businesses, so we have a unique lens. The last few years has been difficult. The cost of living that we've seen, increases in energy prices, increases in mortgage prices. And so there are many parts of the economy that have been really struggling and are continuing to struggle. But actually 2024 has been the turn that we've seen in terms of most people in the country feeling more financially secure. So there's more savings in deposit accounts, there's less people struggling with loans, and actually business confidence is at a 9-year high.
Is the cost of living crisis over, though? We know lots of our viewers have been very upset about the government's idea to take away winter fuel allowance, for example, and there are still people having a hard time. Is it over?
For most people, it's got a lot better. There are definitely some, and we would normally look at about 20% of people in the country who are on the lowest incomes or have the least wealth in the country that are really still struggling to make ends meet, dealing with those difficult choices, dealing with higher mortgage payments. But for most people, you can see the economy is resilient and has an opportunity for a positive outlook.
With this big summit coming and the budget coming, it is very clear that the Chancellor is going to move around the rules about government debt and borrowing in order to free up some cash. But the debt for the country is so high, the national debt is absolutely sky high. How careful does the government need to be?
Well, we do think investment in the UK is fundamental. And it's fundamental, obviously, for the future growth of the economy, for jobs and productivity, but also for overseas investors and for the financial services sector to want to invest. We need to see a clear investment programme in the UK. What does that mean? We need real clarity and purpose around the government's plans. We need discipline around in-year spending. So we need to be really clear around what we can afford in-year and what we're investing in. And we need to see an investment programme from the government that really crowds in or brings in private investment alongside it.
And you want that to happen and they want that to happen. But you say there also has to be discipline. So how careful do they have to be? Because you can see the sort of consensus among many, very well-respected sort of economic commentators is actually, yes, it's fine if she changes the rules in order to invest, but how carefully do you think the government needs to proceed on this front?
Yeah, they need to be careful. So they need to show discipline around the in-year spending. They need to make sure the government can balance the books. But let's be clear, people aren't going to invest in the UK if we don't have a clear plan for growth and productivity and jobs. And that is going to take investment in things like the energy transition, in housing, and in skills and capabilities. So we need to have clarity around where we're going to invest and what the returns will be, and to make it better for people to get a return on those investments.
And have you got the clarity yet, do you think?
I think it's emerging. So what we've seen in the first 100 days of the government is real consistency with the mandate that they set up before they came into government. And we're seeing real focus on things like the energy transition, on housing, and then on some of the key sectors in the UK that can really lead us into a more growth-oriented economy.
It's clear that some taxes are going to go up, and possibly capital gains, which is paid when people sell assets like, property that they have beyond their home or shares. And there have been suggestions it might even hit 39%. I mean, what would the implications of that be, do you think?
So obviously that'll be a matter for the Chancellor and the budget in terms of tax policy. I think what we see in terms of encouraging this investment, one of the unlocks is around pensions in the UK and pensions overseas. Again, we support actually about £200 billion worth of British pensioners' money, and we need to make sure that we can invest that in a way which is good for the economy and good for pensioners long term. So anything that helps people continue to invest and take appropriate risk, we think is really important. Anything that does the opposite would be a handbrake on the economy. So you'd be
worried then about tighter rules about pension or reducing the amount that people can put into their pensions?
Yeah, I think actually pensions and contributions to pensions is critical. We see about 40% of people in the UK have a pension which won't give them even a basic living allowance when they retire. So we need to increase enrolment and investments in pensions.
Isn't it fair, though, that people at the very top end contribute a little bit more given the state of the economy? Now, I mean, a lot of people get paid a lot of money. I mean, you, for example, you get paid more than £3 million. Isn't it fair that people at the top have to cough up a bit more to bail the country out?
So again, I think tax decisions and tax policy is very much a matter for the government. I'm personally very happy to pay the taxes that we do. But of course, what I'm really focused on is how do we move the economy forward and get the growth going across the whole economy. And that's where leveraging pension funds, making sure overseas and domestic investment is working, and we have a clear plan to crowd in more private investment is really important. The estimates on the level of investment we're talking about for the future of the economy is kind of 40 to 50 billion pounds per year for the next 20 years.
50, that's a huge chunk of change.
It's a huge chunk of change. So the government won't be able to do that by themselves, but there are trillions of pounds of investment. And in fact, my own institution has a £900 billion balance sheet, and we lend 80 to 100 billion pounds a year to the UK economy. If we can get the incentives right and crowd in private investment and pension funds, this is not impossible at all. And the UK really is a destination for investors to want to put money to work.
But for people watching at home, though, there are things that affect their daily lives, you know, beyond those talk of trillions and hundreds of billions. And what a lot of people are focused on is what's going on with interest rates and their own mortgage rates. Now, mortgage rates have started to tick up a little bit again. Is the era of the cheap deal, has that just gone? Is it never coming back?
Yeah, so as you say, first of all, the increase in mortgage rates in the last few years has been really challenging. The thing to have in balance around that is only about 40% of properties have a mortgage in the UK, and the average salary and household income of a mortgage family is £75,000. So although it's been very challenging, many of those families have been able to absorb it. Mortgage arrears, people struggling with their mortgage, has actually been declining again since December.
But a cheap deal's going to come back ever, do you think?
So in terms of the cost of mortgages, we've seen them come down this year relative to the highs of last year, which were very difficult for people. We do think they're going to continue to come down, but getting back to the level we saw in the last decade where interest rates were down at zero, I think is unlikely.
Just finally, I want to ask you about another issue, which is another sort of modern phenomenon that banks have to deal with, the huge costs of online fraud and scams. You know, so many of our audience have been hit by all sorts of things. Now, the banks have to pay a lot to compensate people who get caught up in it. But do you think the tech companies are pulling their weight on this front, where a lot of these scams proliferate, whether it's, you know, dodgy deals on your that you pop up on your phone? Do you think they're doing enough?
No, we don't, Laura. So, as you say, fraud is 40% of all individual crime in the UK. It's really harrowing. I listen into calls and hear what people are going through when they experience fraud. And we need to do more to protect customers, not just compensate them. We need to protect them. And 80% of financial fraud in the UK is occurring through the big tech companies. Almost 70% through one company, Meta, Facebook, through its Facebook Marketplace, the Facebook platform and the Instagram platform. And they're the ones that are enabling customers to be contacted by fraudsters and to be able to be messaged so that they are encouraged to send payments which aren't safe. So we really are asking for the tech companies specifically to do more to work with us to protect people.
OK, well, they say they're working with the banks, but that's interesting, very clear message from you that the online companies need to pull their socks up. Well, Charlie and Anne, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's great to have the Chief Executive of Lloyds with us in the studio this morning. Well, let's see what our panel have to say all about all of that. We've been talking about whether the government has really got the right ideas to get the economy going. John, let's come straight to you. What did you make of what Jonathan Reynolds had to say?
I thought he was absolutely right, and everything that he said is all about growing Britain's GDP. If we grow Britain's GDP, we grow revenue for the economy, and we're able to improve all the social services for all of those people that need it. And let's face it, the health service is in a mess, the social services are in a mess. You know, the education system in some areas is in a mess. We really need to dramatically improve the fabric of society for Britain, for the poorer people. We can only, though, do it through the raising of GDP per capita and therefore the tax dollars that come in as a result. We can't just think we can tax the rich, but I make it clear from my viewpoint that I don't think we couldn't raise income tax for the rich by 5 pence on the pound or whatever, because would that make a difference to most people? No, it wouldn't. And the people that want to avoid tax have already left because they don't want to pay the 45%.
So you're saying actually you could put income tax by 5p and it wouldn't make a difference?
I don't think it made any difference at all. It's not about the income tax rate going up by 5p. It's about the whole package of measures that make Britain look environmentally friendly for businesses. Mm-hmm. And when the Labour minister says that the rogue operators like P&O, I don't know the ins and outs of that. Mm. But what I do know is it's politically stupid to condemn somebody when you want them to invest in Britain. What you should be doing is working behind the scenes to persuade them to improve their relationships, to do things that are more in line with humanitarian employment, rather than just blast them on the TV and cause a real headline that's damaging to the Labour Party and damaging to the business. We need to treasure these people, but persuade them internally to improve what they do as a humanitarian society.
Daisy, did Jonathan Reynolds persuade you?
What we Liberal Democrats have been saying, and what we hope the Labour government will hear, is that fundamentally we've got to fix our NHS and care, because health and wealth are two sides of the same coin, and we're not going to get our economy back on track unless we fix our NHS and care services. And we've set out many ideas in our manifesto on how that could happen. But I would agree one of the really important things is not only to get inward investment, but we've also got to support our small businesses. You know, we've got small businesses and high streets that are still really, really struggling after the pandemic and Brexit and everything else that's happened. And I really want to see something from the Labour government that's going to support our small businesses and also get our NHS and care back on their feet.
But in the big picture, where we think things are heading with the budget, it looks incredibly likely that Rachel Reeves is going to move around the rules so that she can borrow more money to invest more money. Are the Lib Dems going to back her doing that?
I think productive borrowing is a good thing. We've got to remember that after the last Conservative government, so many things are broken. We have crumbling hospitals, we've got crumbling schools, we've got crumbling prisons. You've got to get the money from somewhere, and borrowing to invest in a way that's going to be productive and boost the economy is a good thing. But on all the other taxes, what I would say is Liberal Democrats are very clear. We should not be putting up taxes on struggling families whilst we're still in a cost of living crisis. But there are big corporations that could be paying a little bit more to get our public services back on their feet.
Well, John said he's happy to pay an extra 5p on income tax, so that might be a big amount of cash in itself. But just to press you on that specific, though, if Rachel Reeves comes to the dispatch box at the budget and says, despite saying I'm not going to tinker with things, I am going to change the government debt and borrowing rules so that I can spend more on roads and rails or whatever it may be, will the Lib Dems support her in doing that?
On that very specific measure, we do think that if she does decide to change those rules, it would be a good thing to do. It's already been welcomed by a number of sort of financial economic think tanks as well. And I think we have got to find ways of investing to rebuild our country. We Liberal Democrats want the Labour government to be really ambitious. And if we can raise more capital to invest and rebuild our hospitals and our schools, and we can do that in a way whilst retaining economic stability at the same time, then absolutely we would support that.
Brian, this all comes at a time when Labour's just passed its 100 days in office. What do you make of what they've done? I mean, Keir Starmer said he's had some side wins and choppy days, which I think is political speak for saying they've been some absolute howlers. But how would you review their performance?
I find it really difficult because I really don't think much of their performance, honestly. But as John just picked up on, there are so many other elements too which are really undermining what we do, particularly the things like TikTok, like Facebook, what have you. And these are very difficult to control. These are almost impossible to control. So ultimately, they have an undermining effect. And we've got to have some way of controlling that, some way of actually shoring up our economy in that way so that we don't have these rogue people kind of undermining it all the time. And that's so difficult now because there's so much going on. We're not at the mercy of it's not a straight game anymore. It's quite convoluted. And it's that convolution that is actually undermining at the end of the day.
That's interesting. One thing that is in the government's control, though, was their decision early on, which surprised a lot of people, including in their own party, as well as many of our viewers, was the decision about winter fuel. Now, you, if you don't mind me saying, you would qualify for the winter fuel payment. I think, John, you might also as well. What do you think of them removing it from the majority of pensioners?
I think that there's, again, there are people who can afford it, and there are people who can't afford it. And there are elderly people who can afford it and elderly people who can't afford it. But it's a sort of, when you make a sort of bland kind of pass of that, it kind of, undermines the situation because you're not actually looking at the reality. And the reality, there are people who can afford to forgo winter fuel. But there are a lot of people, I don't know what the proportion is, but there's many people who can't afford it. And they have to be considered.
John, what did you make of that decision?
I think it's absolutely right. I think it's just ridiculous that the wealthier pensioners, and I don't just mean me with my wealth, I'm talking about lots of wealthier pensioners, have that sort of allowance. Why would we complex society with multiple allowances? They get pension credits. Make certain that when you abolish something, you look after the poorer members of the pensioner community and you do it through pensioner credits. Solve that problem and save maybe hundreds of millions on the people that don't need that allowance and simplify the system.
It's interesting, though, we don't even know how much this is actually going to save now, because if more people claim pension credit, then actually it might end up balancing out. Daisy, you were shaking your head then.
Yeah, look, I think it's the wrong decision. We're very clear it's the wrong decision, and we really want to urge Labour to think again. Of course, there are wealthier pensioners who readily admit themselves that they don't need it, but Age UK has said there are around 2 million very vulnerable pensioners who are going to lose out, and they've had no time to plan. Well, precisely.
We can solve them on
but so the
pensioner
Labour
credits.
government could think again. They could either reinstate the winter fuel allowance and make it taxable, or they could maybe raise pension credit. But ultimately, I think some of the statistics show that if everybody who was entitled to pension credit actually took it up, it might actually cost even more. So I think this has been done in a very clumsy way. It's wrong, and we still urge the Labour government to think again to protect the most vulnerable.
I don't agree with that at all, because the very point that you make, that if everybody claimed it would cost us more, well, if they're entitled to it, they should get it. And why shouldn't it cost us more? You know, if we've got pensioners out there that are not claiming it because they don't understand how to do it or whatever.
Because the pension credit form is so incredibly long and complicated.
Yeah, but that's not the point. You said it would cost us more. It doesn't matter if it costs us more. If that's fair and right and proper, it should cost us more, and we get the money from somewhere else. But I just make the point, why are all the wealthy pensioners, and I don't mean wealthy being rich pensioners, I mean those that can afford, why should they get a pensioner credit, credit or get a winter fuel allowance? It's nonsense.
Briefly?
I think we agree on the same principles. We both agree that the richest shouldn't get it, but we both agree the Labour government needs to think again to find a way of making sure the most vulnerable don't lose out.
We don't agree on that, because the simple point is that I don't know whether they've thought again. I don't know. You know, the big point of all of this is, are politicians good operators? Do they just talk a good story, or do they follow through with the operation that they need to do to put things right?
Are politicians good operators is something that we debate every single week.
The answer to that is going to become clear, isn't it? Will they deal with this winter fuel allowance abolition in a correct and fair and proper way? I hope they do.
Okay,
but that's only one part of it.
It is only one part of it, and we might come back to this at the end, because that debate has been raging for a couple of months now, and there's no sign of it going away in this studio or anywhere else. All three of you, thank you for now. We'll be back with you in a while. So, talking of political operators who have incredible influence, but only a handful of politicians truly change their countries in the course of their career. Alex Salmond was one who certainly did. He took the SNP from the fringes to the First Minister's office, and to see the SNP becoming the most powerful force in Scotland, and nearly, very nearly, managing to take Scotland out of the United Kingdom to independence. He put his party on the map and the union on the agenda in ways that terrified the main UK parties. He lost the argument in 2014, and then ultimately he left the SNP for a smaller party, Alba. But he was still making his case not long ago. We last spoke to him in April.
What's in the interest of Scotland just now, in my estimation, is to get independence back to the top of the political agenda, to move away from the culture wars, identity politics that are so divisive in Scottish society, and to get the Scottish Parliament onto, let's call it the people's agenda.
There were, though, multiple claims about his behaviour around women over the years. He was never convicted, but his lawyer admitted during a high-profile trial that he did behave badly. Then, of course, there was the bitterest fallout with Nicola Sturgeon, his protégé, and that soured the last few years. It was a rift between him and the party he'd built and loved was never healed, before his death yesterday afternoon at the age of only 69. Well, we can talk now this morning to John Swinney, who's Scotland's current First Minister and leader of the SNP. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. I know it's a difficult weekend for plenty of people in the SNP. For everyone watching First Minister who'd seen him on TV but never met him, what was he like?
Alec was a very significant figure in every respect. That he led from the front. He had a very bold agenda about how he wanted to transform Scotland and to make Scotland an independent country. And he led a team of which I was a part for many years who got very close to achieving that objective. So he was a very significant figure in Scottish politics, in UK politics. He set the agenda. And at this sad moment where we mark his untimely death, I want to express my deepest sympathy to his wife Moira and to his family at Alec's untimely death.
He was certainly a significant figure, as you say, but how would you describe the legacy he leaves behind?
He inspired a generation of people to believe in Scottish independence, and that generation is still believing in Scottish independence and still wants Scottish independence. So Alec left a fundamental footprint on Scottish politics on that significant issue. He also, as you said in one of your comments a moment ago, took the SNP from the fringes of Scottish politics to the heart of government, and we were successful in being elected to government in 2007, and we've been in government ever since. And so much of the achievements that we have been able to build have been built on that sense of drive to make sure that we serve the people of Scotland, and that was very much the ethos that underpinned the government that Alec Salmond led.
In the last few years, though, he didn't have an easy relationship with the SNP. He'd left the party. There'd been multiple allegations about his behaviour and a lot of bitterness between him and Nicola Sturgeon, who he'd been so close to for many years. She always describes him as having been her mentor. Had you, as a close colleague of both of them, First Minister, hoped that rift might be healed?
Obviously, it's been a very difficult few years, and there'll be time to reflect on all of those issues in the days to come. But I think today, all of us can recognise the formidable contribution that Alec Salmond made to transforming the Scottish National Party into a party of government, transforming Scotland into a country that believed ever more that its future was as an independent country. And that's been a significant contribution to the change in our politics.
He was frustrated, though, in the last few years that, in his view, the SNP was simply not doing enough to be vigorous enough about making the case for independence, about keeping going, about keeping that momentum up. Didn't he have a point, actually, that many of your supporters heard you promise a move to independence again and again and again, and then nothing really happened?
I think the difficulty that we've encountered is that we've met a roadblock called Westminster intransigence, and a UK government that has just folded its arms and said, we will not engage on this particular question. And the lesson I draw from that, as somebody who's devoted their entire adult life to trying to make Scotland an independent country, is what we've got to do is we've got to create a mood in Scotland and a level of support in Scotland that makes a compelling case for Scottish independence, so that it is literally impossible to resist the pressure that Scotland wants to become an independent country. And that's what I'm devoting my leadership to doing, to serving the people of Scotland and to making that case for Scottish independence that becomes so compelling that the Westminster government cannot resist the pressure that we put on for Scotland to become an independent country. Now, I accept that decision has got to be taken by the people of Scotland, and it's got to be taken in an open democratic fashion. But we've got to create the impetus around that, and that's what we intend to do.
And forget the politics for a second, First Minister. From a personal point of view, what will your abiding memory of him be?
Obviously, I worked very closely with Alec Salmond, and I suspect the moment where I was most touched by what he did was when I was driving to Edinburgh on the day after the 2007 election, and I listened to him speaking on the radio when he'd arrived in Edinburgh, and he talked about how Scotland had changed and changed forever and would never be the same again because of our election win in 2007. And it was a deeply emotional moment for me because I heard my party leader at the time indicating that we had taken a colossal step forward on our journey to independence. And I fondly remember that moment and what it meant to me in signifying the progress that we had made.
First Minister John Swinney, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Alec Salmond, who died yesterday in Northern Macedonia, aged 69. Now, the Tory race has already had a surprise this week when James Cleverly was booted out. There's only a couple of weeks left for members to make their minds up between the final two, Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch. Now, we invited both of them to come and talk to me and you this morning. Kemi Badenoch wasn't available, but perhaps she will be next week. But Robert Jenrick certainly is here and with us this morning.
Good morning,
now,
Laura.
Good morning. Now, we talked to you a couple of weeks ago at the Tory conference, and you had plenty of questions from me. So this morning we're going to do something different. We've got some questions from our brilliant viewers, and they have an element of mystery around them. We're going to show you that you can pick questions from them in order. So you might get a clue from some of what you could see there, but you can choose the order that you'd like to go in. So which one would you like first?
Well, I'll go for this. I'm not quite sure where the number one is, but let's go for that one.
OK. Question number one. Now, our viewers and you will no doubt recognise Richard Desmond. He's a wealthy businessman and Tory donor. Now, when you were Housing Secretary in government, you have accepted that you approved £1 billion development of his unlawfully. Matthew, our viewer, wants to know, why did you rush through his reversal of the planning decision regarding Richard Desmond's project to save him tens of millions of pounds? So you accepted you made a mistake doing it, but why did you do it?
Well, immediately after the 2019 general election, where we had been elected on a manifesto commitment, which was absolutely the right one, to increase the number of new homes being built in this country, we decided to approve the big schemes that came before us. And we approved the 5 largest planning applications that we had. This was one of them, a big scheme on brownfield land in inner East London, exactly the sort of place that you should be building homes. The developer in question, he asked me about it. I told him not to talk about it. I regret, obviously, that I was subject to the mischaracterisation as to what our motivation was, which was simply to get homes built. And I would just point out that a couple of weeks ago, earlier in the summer, the Labour-controlled Tower Hamlets Council have approved exactly the same scheme as the one that I approved back in the day.
But you admitted that you made the decision in the wrong way, and there were, and you've referred to it there, suspicions that you made that decision because you sat next to him at a dinner and he was giving money to the party. I suppose the question that Matthew's asking is how can people trust you to make future decisions properly when you made that one in the wrong way?
Well, there was no impropriety. The issue was that I allowed a mischaracterisation to grow up by the fact that he sat next to me at this dinner. I told him not to talk about it at the time. But the broader issue is we've got to build more homes in this country. And I 100% stand by the verve and determination that I brought to that role, which actually led to the largest number of new homes being started in this country under my tenure since 1987, since Margaret Thatcher was our Prime Minister. And we've got to get back to that. The number of homes being built has fallen since, and that's wrong. That's hurting the most vulnerable in our society. In particular, it's hurting young people. And that's one of my big commitments. If I lead this party, we will be the party of home ownership once again. OK, right, next question. So you've had number 1, 2, 3 or 4? 2.
2. OK, now, clever viewers will know that that shape is of Northern Ireland. Now, one of your central promises in your campaign is to take the country out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a big legal framework. The UK has been part of it for decades. And it's important because when it comes to Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, it's in that text as being something that is absolutely vital. Ian Cork wants to know, can you explain what leaving the ECHR would do in terms of the direct impact on the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, if I can just step back and say, why do we need to leave the ECHR?
Well, we talked about that last time you were on the programme.
Well, it's important just for
this is the specific question.
Just to know. I don't approach this from an ideological perspective.
Really?
I approach it from a practical one. What I saw at the Home Office was a British state unable to do its most basic duty, secure our borders, keep the public safe. I wouldn't do this lightly. It's not reformable. There's 46 member states, from Andorra to Iceland to Turkey.
Talked to you
You'll
about
never
this
get
before,
unanimity.
But there's a specific
what we need to do is ensure
Ireland.
that there isn't a knock-on consequence in Northern Ireland.
So how would you do that?
The Good Friday Agreement is not reliant upon the ECHR.
It's a fundamental part of it.
Well, it envisages a Northern Irish Bill of Rights, which would protect the citizens of Northern Ireland domestically according to the ECHR. And that's what I propose. I propose that we have a British Bill of Rights, or indeed a Northern Irish Bill of Rights, which does what the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement suggested and protects the rights of those citizens. I don't think it's impossible for the country of Magna Carta and habeas corpus to find a way to ensure that the rights and liberties of our own citizens, whether in Northern Ireland or anywhere else across our country, are properly protected and respected,
Do you think
as they were prior to us joining the ECHR.
Do you think that the nationalist community in Sinn Féin would sit down and think, OK, they're going to accept a British Bill of Rights? I mean, you can say, oh, you just do another piece of legislation. But the Good Friday Agreement explicitly says that the ECHR is part of the legal framework there.
Well, all enduring agreements require a degree of pragmatism, and you see that with the Good Friday Agreement in many different respects. I mean, for example, it speaks of a Northern Irish Bill of Rights, which in fact Tony Blair, as Prime Minister, chose not to proceed with. He chose to do a Human Rights Act instead. So there are different ways of resolving this issue. What I want to do is ensure the rights of Northern Irish citizens are protected domestically, rather than reliant upon a foreign court in Strasbourg. And I say, I wouldn't do this lightly. I'm doing this because I don't want to have criminals on our streets who we need to get out. I don't want terror suspects on our streets or in our prisons. And those are things that matter to people of all parts of the community in Northern Ireland, as it does to people across the country.
We've talked about that before, and here are some more questions from our viewers. So you've got 2 left. Which one are you going to pick?
Go for 3.
OK, number 3. Now, that shows you, look, alongside Ken Clarke during the referendum campaign, a somewhat younger Robert Jenrick and a younger Kenneth Clarke talking about the referendum. Now, one of our viewers has found that at the time, you were signatory to a letter that said leaving the EU would lead us into a dystopia. Julie asks, Robert Jenrick was a signatory to a letter that describes Brexit as dystopia. Do you still agree with any of its contents? And in case you'd forgotten, you said, we prefer the advantages of membership to a go-it-alone, us-against-them dystopia.
Well, I don't remember that letter, but my view has changed, absolutely. I was concerned that it would prove difficult for the British state to realise all the benefits of Brexit. And in some respects, I've been justified in that regard. We've had a great deal of economic and constitutional disruption as a result of leaving the European Union, but I don't think we've gained all of the benefits, and that's what I want to see. And in my jobs as a minister, I've always fought to ensure that we do get the benefits of this, whether it's starting free ports, whether it's as immigration minister, ensuring that we use the levers of legal migration now that we've ended freedom of movement to gain control over our borders.
Do you disagree with your younger self?
Well, I would vote differently. I've said that on many occasions. I would vote differently if I had the opportunity today. I've seen, for example, on immigration, that leaving the European Union has given us something which we have not had before in our history, which is the ability to control our borders and to have a proper philosophy as a country on our immigration system. Now, those decisions were poorly made in the immediate aftermath of the 2019 general election. I'm the first to concede
that. By the government you were part of?
The ministers at the time made poor decisions. They created an immigration system which was even more liberal than the one we had in the EU. I fought relentlessly to change that, and I did so as a minister. And ultimately, I resigned when I felt that I couldn't do even more. Okay. What I want to do is ensure the next Conservative government actually gets the full benefit of Brexit, which I think are very significant.
OK, and we only have number 4 left. So let's ask you that question. It's about your time as Immigration Minister. Now, Gemma wants to know, do you regret ordering the painting over of cartoon murals at a facility for unaccompanied migrant children?
Well, I've said I wouldn't do that again. But let me explain why.
That's not her question. Do you regret doing it?
Yeah, I've said that I regret doing. I wouldn't do it again. But let me explain why. Firstly, I would never do anything to needlessly harm children in our care. And as Immigration Minister, I worked very hard to protect those children who come here unaccompanied. I closed all of the rudimentary hotels in which they were being housed. And I've always cared about us being a big-hearted country. I was the first...
You ordered a cartoon mural to be painted over.
I was the first Member of Parliament to house Ukrainian refugees in my home when we first started welcoming families from Ukraine. But I did feel very strongly then, and do so now, that it is very concerning that there are adults coming into our country, posing as children, putting genuine children at great risk. And let me give you an example of one of the things that happened as a result of that. A man who turned out to be a serial killer came into our country, posed as a child, lived amongst young people in the loving care of foster carers, went to a school in the UK, went on to kill somebody on the streets of Bournemouth. Sadly, these things are happening, not in huge numbers, but they are happening across our country. And it is right that when people first arrive in the UK, they are subject to checks in a law enforcement environment. And that was the point. We needed to ensure that was happening, and you weed out the adults who are posing as children, to protect the actual children. I think that was the right decision.
OK, well, Robert Jenrick, who was Immigration Minister, who was Housing Secretary, it's always good to have you with us in the studio, and thank you for taking the questions from our audience. And perhaps they were tougher than the ones that we often ask here in the studio. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks.
Well, let's see what our panel have to say about the Tory race that is underway in terms of who their next leader is going to be. Now, Daisy, it's interesting. You took loads of seats from the Tories at the general election, and it does seem that these days the Liberal Democrats are definitely targeting the Conservatives much more than the government. What did you make of what you heard there?
Honestly, Laura, I've got a real sense of incredulity having listened to that interview, as I'm sure many of your viewers at home will feel. The fact of the matter is that right now, people can't see a GP, people can't see a dentist. They're struggling with the cost of living. People want Britain to stand proud on the international stage, and the whole of the Tory leadership contest seems to be on these kind of fringe issues, with two potential applicants who want to put the Good Friday Agreement at risk and show very little compassion to children who are fleeing war and persecution. Quite frankly, I think the pursuit of culture wars and divisive politics is very damaging for our political culture. But also, I think what that interview showed is that on every single issue facing this country, the Conservatives can't be a serious opposition because their fingerprints are across everything. And so whilst they're failing to be a good opposition, we Liberal Democrats are ready to step up.
John, once upon a time you did give money to the Conservative Party, and you're now a Labour backer. Have you seen or heard anything that would make you give to them again?
Unfortunately not. And we do need a strong Conservative Party in opposition. We do need that. We need the Liberal. We need strong political parties to have an option to vote for somebody who can competently run this country. At the moment, I'm perfectly happy with my decision to back Labour, but I do want the Conservatives reborn. But nothing I see of them at the moment suggests that that's going to be of any significance. They really got to get their act together in a big way. They've got to be big thinkers and put... there's two issues that affect every man, woman and child in this country. One is GDP growth, because that's the way you get the services, and the second one is climate change. And unless they put these world issues at the forefront of their policy, dabbling about with other things. I've been quoted many times that it's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
And Brian, I know you're never going to be someone, I think, who sits there and says, I'm going to wholeheartedly back the Conservatives. But if you were making a movie of where the Tory party is now, what would you call it? Or a drama? How would you describe it?
Incredulity. They're incredulous. They are ridiculous. That was ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. I thought, I couldn't understand. I thought, what is this man doing? Who is he? We have an expression in Scotland, which is, his head is full of mince. Do you know what that means?
I know what that means, but explain it to our viewers, because they don't all have the same Scottish lexicon as you and me.
Well, it means that he just doesn't know. I mean, the whole thing about Northern Ireland is just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Well, when you think of the Good Friday Agreement and the care and what went into that, it's absolutely nonsense. A man, if they get him as leader, they're welcome to it.
And yet lots of our viewers are really worried about what's happening in terms of immigration in this country, and lots of Conservatives
Immigration in this country is a problem. There's no question about it. But you're not going to solve it that way. The problem with immigration is what's been happening in the Middle East, what's happening in the Middle East right now. Can you imagine the amount of immigrants we're going to see even more? It's a world problem. It's not just a British problem. It's a world problem. And we don't attend to it properly.
OK. All right. Well, all three of you, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I mean, so many things that we've talked about. It's been great to have your company. Thank you, of course, most of all to you for watching at home, as we've considered all sorts of things. The huge legacy of Alex Salmond and how Keir Starmer is planning to get the economy growing. They warm up to their summit this week after some red faces offending the owners of P&O ferries. But the investment summit tomorrow will probably pale into insignificance compared with the budget that is coming soon. That is likely to be the moment this new government knows it can really make or break. No pressure on Rachel Reeves. You can, of course, catch up with anything on iPlayer today, and I'll be with Paddy O'Connell for this Sunday's newscast on BBC Sounds later. But, of course, I'll look forward to seeing you next Sunday, same time, same place.